doesn't appear to be any reason. I've seen you somewhere before. I don't know your name, stranger, but your face is familiar. You always had that mustache.
Meshed wasn't just a groundbreaking anti-war comedy. It was a chaotic battlefield of its own, where the director and stars waged war against studio executives, while the cast descended into real-life rivalries that mirrored their on-screen characters. What you saw on screen was calculated anarchy, but what happened behind the camera was pure pandemonium. Director Robert Altman battling Fox executives who hated the dailies. Donald Sutherland and Elliott Gould trying to get Altman fired. An entire cast improvising dialogue while military veterans stormed off set. Blood-soaked surgeons drinking real scotch between takes. And the football game finale that sent actors to the hospital with legitimate injuries. Today, I'm revealing 20 weird facts about Mass EHH that will change how you see this iconic film forever. And stick around for our bonus fact. The disturbing real-world consequence that nobody talks about, even 5 decades later. So scrub in, pour yourself a martini, and prepare for surgery on one of cinema's most influential dark comedies. Fact number 1. The studio wanted to bury the film. 20th Century Fox wasn't excited about Mass. They were terrified of it. The studio had just suffered massive financial losses from big-budget musicals like Dr. Dolittle and Star, and viewed this bizarre Korean War comedy as a potential career killer. Studio head Richard Zanuck actively tried to bury the film, scheduling it for a limited release in a handful of theaters. He told colleagues, "This thing is going to die a quick death." Zanuck was so convinced of its failure that when Robert Altman requested an additional $35,000 for the climactic football sequence, Zanuck approved it immediately, believing he was simply throwing money into a doomed project. It wasn't a vote of confidence. It was resignation. The studio was so certain of failure that they gave the film minimal marketing support and essentially abandoned it to die quietly. Instead, Mass H exploded into a cultural phenomenon, grossing over $80 million against its modest $3.5 million budget, and saving the studio that had tried to kill it. Fact number 2. 15 directors rejected the script before Altman. Mass H wasn't the hot property everyone was fighting to direct. It was Hollywood's unwanted stepchild. 15 established directors flat-out rejected the script before Fox reluctantly offered it to 45-year-old Robert Altman, who was primarily known for directing television episodes. When Altman received the call, he wasn't even the studio's 16th choice. He was simply the first director desperate enough to say yes. Producer Ingo Preminger had worked his way through a list that reportedly included Arthur Penn, Sidney Pollack, Stanley Kubrick, and Bob Rafelson, all of whom found the material either too offensive or too challenging. What the other directors couldn't see, Altman immediately grasped. He told the studio, "This isn't a comedy about war, it's about insanity." While reading the script, he scribbled 3 words in the margin that would define his approach. "This is real." His status as a Hollywood outsider wasn't a liability. It was precisely why he could transform a rejected script into a revolutionary film that would redefine American cinema. Fact number 3. The stars tried to get Altman fired. Donald Sutherland and Elliott Gould weren't just playing army doctors who clashed with authority. They were actively conspiring to get their own director fired during production. The conflict erupted just weeks into filming when the actors became convinced Altman was creating a chaotic environment that undermined their performances. Gould later admitted, "I was acting like a star, not an actor." The 2 stars secretly met with producer Ingo Preminger to demand Altman's removal, complaining about his improvisational style and constantly changing script. Preminger not only refused, but threatened to replace the actors instead. He told them bluntly, "Directors are a dime a dozen. Good actors aren't easy to find, but I'll replace you both if I have to." The humiliated stars returned to set, forced to work with a director they had just tried to sabotage. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Hawkeye and Trapper John, the film's anti-authority rebels, had themselves become the very military bureaucracy they were mocking on screen. Fact number 4. Robert Duvall's character was based on a real surgeon who sued the filmmakers. The character of Major Frank Burns wasn't just a fictional antagonist. He was based on a real Korean War surgeon who recognized himself in the film and took legal action. Dr. H. Richard Hornberger, who wrote the original novel under the pseudonym Richard Hooker, based the character partly on a surgeon he served with in Korea. When this real-life surgeon saw the film, he immediately recognized aspects of himself in Frank Burns's character, particularly the scene where Burns is caught in a compromising position with Hot Lips Houlihan. What audiences didn't know was that this surgeon filed a lawsuit against the filmmakers, claiming defamation of character. The case never made it to trial, as Fox quietly settled out of court for an undisclosed sum. Robert Duvall, who played Burns, later said, "I was essentially portraying a real person who was still alive and practicing medicine." That knowledge added pressure to an already difficult role. The settlement included a provision that neither the studio nor the original surgeon could ever publicly discuss the terms or confirm the surgeon's identity. Fact number 5. Sally Kellerman's shower scene wasn't in the script. The infamous shower scene where Major Hot Lips Houlihan is exposed to the entire camp wasn't just uncomfortable to watch. It was a traumatic experience that wasn't even in the original screenplay. Sally Kellerman arrived on set that day, expecting to film a different scene. When Altman explained his idea to raise the tent walls and expose her character to the camp, she initially refused. "I told him absolutely not," Kellerman recalled. "I was terrified." Altman persuaded her by promising the scene would be filmed tastefully, with strategic camera angles. What Altman didn't tell her was that he planned to have hundreds of extras playing military personnel rush to watch, creating a carnival-like atmosphere. When the tent walls went up during filming, Kellerman wasn't acting. Her scream of humiliation was genuine. The experience was so devastating that Kellerman locked herself in her trailer afterward, refusing to come out. She later credited this scene with transforming her character from a one-dimensional antagonist to a sympathetic figure, saying, "That violation gave me somewhere to go with the character." Fact number 6. The blood wasn't fake. Those surgery scenes weren't created with Hollywood fake blood. Robert Altman insisted on an unsettling level of medical realism that made even the actors queasy on set. Altman hired real-life medical technicians and nurses as consultants who provided actual medical equipment and demonstrated authentic surgical techniques. The blood used in surgery scenes was a mixture of food coloring and real animal organs obtained from a local butcher each morning before filming. During operating room scenes, actors were literally cutting into animal organs filled with this blood mixture. Donald Sutherland recalled, "The smell was unbearable under the hot lights. We weren't acting disgusted. We were genuinely nauseated. What appears on screen isn't special effects wizardry, but genuine reactions from actors handling real organic material." Several crew members fainted during these scenes, and one camera operator had to be permanently reassigned after repeatedly becoming ill. This commitment to graphic realism wasn't just for shock value. It created the film's signature contrast between the horrors of war and the comedic coping mechanisms of the characters forced to confront them. Fact number 7. The dialogue was largely improvised. That rapid-fire, overlapping dialogue that became Altman's signature style? It wasn't meticulously scripted. It was mostly improvised by actors who were encouraged to talk over each other. Altman's revolutionary approach involved setting up multiple microphones around the set and allowing scenes to unfold naturally. He told the cast, "Don't wait for the other person to finish their line. interrupt each other like you would in real life. This technique, which later became known as Altmanesque dialogue, was initially despised by the sound department. The sound technicians, accustomed to traditional filmmaking with clear, individual dialogue lines, were so frustrated they threatened to quit. One sound mixer complained directly to the studio, "We can't distinguish who's saying what. This is unusable footage." Altman's response was simple. That's exactly the point. He wanted the audience to feel like eavesdroppers catching fragments of conversation, forcing them to lean in and actively engage with the film. This approach was so revolutionary that when the film was later dubbed for television, translators had to invent dialogue for scenes where the original lines were unintelligible. Fact number 8. The football game sent actors to real hospitals. The climactic football game wasn't choreographed movie action. It was genuine brutality that resulted in multiple injuries and hospital visits. Altman wanted authentic football violence, so he hired actual football players and told them not to hold back. He paired these athletes against the actors playing the surgeons, creating a genuinely dangerous mismatch. The studio's insurance representatives nearly shut down production when they realized what was happening. Fred Williamson, a former professional football player cast as Spear Chucker Jones, broke 2 ribs during filming. Donald Sutherland suffered a serious shoulder injury that still bothers him decades later. Elliott Gould recalled, "It wasn't acting anymore. It was survival." What audiences didn't know was that Altman deliberately orchestrated this chaos, believing the real pain and exhaustion would translate to film authenticity. After particularly violent takes, he would shout, "That's great! Let's go again!" while injured actors limped back into position. The scene's brutal realism comes from the simple fact that you're watching actors genuinely trying to protect themselves from being hurt, creating what critic Roger Ebert called the most honest sports sequence ever filmed. Fact number 9. The Last Supper scene had religious authorities demanding cuts. The Last Supper scene before the suicide of Captain Painless wasn't just darkly comic. It was considered so blasphemous that religious groups demanded its removal from the film. Altman deliberately staged the scene as a direct visual reference to Leonardo da Vinci's painting, with the suicidal dentist in the Jesus position, surrounded by 12 disciples before his planned death. The scene features the doctors drinking martinis from a chalice-like vessel and breaking bread together, unmistakable communion imagery. When Catholic organizations got wind of the scene after early screenings, they launched an immediate protest. The Catholic Legion of Decency demanded the scene be cut entirely, threatening to condemn the film and organize boycotts. The National Council of Churches called it a deliberate mockery of Christianity's most sacred moment. Studio executives begged Altman to remove or modify the scene. His response was defiant. "It's meant to be uncomfortable. If it doesn't offend someone, I haven't done my job." The scene remained intact, but this controversy partly explains why the film, despite its commercial and critical success, was kept at arm's length during that year's Academy Awards. Fact number 10. The film was shot in sequence. Unlike most films that shoot scenes out of order based on location efficiency, Mass HH was filmed almost entirely in sequence, a technique that fundamentally transformed the performances. This approach wasn't artistic. It was financial necessity. The budget was so tight that sets had to be built as they went, with materials from completed scenes being recycled for upcoming ones. This limitation became a creative advantage, as actors could build their character arcs naturally. What audiences didn't know was that this sequential filming created a method-like immersion for the cast. The early scenes featured genuinely unfamiliar actors meeting for the first time. By the final football sequence, you're watching people who have lived together for months, developing the same bonds and rivalries as their characters. Go ahead and like and subscribe, because I'm about to reveal how this chronological shooting approach led to genuine relationship breakdowns among the cast, with personal conflicts that began mirroring their on-screen dynamics, including two actors who stopped speaking to each other entirely halfway through production. Fact number 11. The announcements were recorded in one overnight session. Those iconic PA announcements that punctuate the film weren't carefully scripted comedic moments. They were improvised in a single, all-night recording session fueled by exhaustion and alcohol. Actor David Arkin, who played the unnamed PA announcer, and Altman locked themselves in a sound booth after a full day of shooting with a case of beer and a loose collection of ideas. As the night progressed and sobriety waned, the announcements became increasingly absurd. What began at 10 p.m. didn't end until 6 a.m. the following morning. By dawn, they had recorded over 4 hours of announcements, most of which were unusable due to either technical issues or content too outrageous even for this boundary-pushing film. Altman later selected announcements from this session and strategically placed them throughout the film, often using them to comment ironically on the action or to bridge scenes. The announcer's increasingly slurred delivery throughout the film isn't acting. It's the actual progression of Arkin's intoxication during the marathon recording session. The most famous announcement, "Attention, tonight's movie is MASH," was actually the final one recorded, when Arkin could barely form words coherently. Fact number 12. The studio tried to cut the scene about racism. The powerful scene where Spearchucker Jones reveals he was relegated to the kitchen in a previous unit because of his race almost didn't make the final cut. Not because of its content, but because of studio fears about its marketability. Fox executives viewed the scene as unnecessarily confrontational and argued for its removal. One studio memo described it as potentially alienating to Southern audiences. Their concern wasn't the racist behavior depicted, but that acknowledging racism existed might hurt box office numbers in certain regions. Altman fought viciously to keep the scene, arguing that sanitizing the film's portrayal of military racism would undermine its entire anti-authoritarian message. The standoff became so heated that Altman threatened to remove his name from the film if the scene was cut. What makes this especially significant is that actor Fred Williamson, who played Jones, had experienced similar discrimination during his football career. His performance isn't just acting, it's informed by personal experience. When he delivers the line, "I was the best cutter in the outfit, but they made me work in the kitchen," the restrained anger comes from a genuine place that transcends the character. Fact number 13. The iconic theme song was almost rejected. Suicide is Painless, the hauntingly memorable theme song, wasn't written by a professional composer. It was hastily created by Altman's 14-year-old son for $500, a song that would eventually earn millions in royalties. When Altman needed a song for the Last Supper suicide scene, he initially attempted to write it himself. After struggling, he asked his teenage son Michael to take a shot at it, requesting something stupid enough to believably be written by an army camp amateur. The studio executives were horrified when they heard the morbid lyrics about suicide being a painless way to fly and demanded a replacement. Altman refused, arguing that the song's darkness perfectly captured the film's tone. When they suggested keeping the melody but changing the lyrics, he pointed out that his contract gave him control over the music. What nobody could have predicted was that Johnny Mandel's arrangement of this teenager's song would become one of the most recognized television themes in history when it was later used for the Mass TV series. Michael Altman's $500 payment would have been worth millions had he retained the rights, something his father later expressed regret about, saying, "I was a fool not to give him a percentage." Fact of Fascia 14. The original author hated the film. Richard Hornberger, who wrote the original novel under the pseudonym Richard Hooker, despised Altman's adaptation so thoroughly that he refused to acknowledge its existence in interviews. Hornberger, a conservative military surgeon who had served in Korea, wrote a darkly comic but ultimately patriotic book. He was horrified when he saw Altman's anti-authority, anti-war interpretation. After a private screening, he reportedly walked out halfway through and told producer Ingo Preminger, "That's not my book. That's not my war." What particularly infuriated Hornberger was how Altman portrayed military hierarchy and religious figures as hypocritical and corrupt. In Hornberger's novel, the doctors may be irreverent, but they still respect the military mission. Altman's film suggests the entire war effort is absurd. The author was so distressed by the adaptation that he later wrote additional MASH novels, hoping to correct what he saw as a perversion of his work. When interviewed about the film's success, he would only say, "My characters were hijacked by a man with an agenda I don't share." He refused all invitations to MASH anniversary events if Altman would be present, maintaining this position until his death in 1997. Fact number 15. The famous Hot Lips name was a mistake. The nickname Hot Lips for Margaret Houlihan wasn't a clever invention from the script. It was actually a blooper that Altman decided to keep. During an early take, actor Tom Skerritt, who played Duke Forrest, flubbed a line and accidentally called Sally Kellerman's character Hot Lips instead of Major Houlihan. Kellerman immediately broke character, and the crew expected Altman to call for another take. Instead, he shouted, "That's perfect! Keep it in!" From that point forward, Altman instructed the cast to occasionally use the nickname, believing it perfectly captured how military men might privately refer to a female superior. What began as an actor's mistake evolved into one of the most recognizable character nicknames in film history. The improvised nature of this nickname created continuity problems throughout filming, as scenes had to be adjusted to reference the new moniker. Sally Kellerman later said the nickname helped her understand her character better. It humanized her in a way the script hadn't. It made her a woman first, an officer second. The TV series would later embrace this mistake so completely that most viewers never realized Hot Lips wasn't part of the original character conception. Fact number 16. Actors drank real alcohol during filming. Those martinis weren't water or colored juice. The cast was drinking actual alcohol during many scenes, a directive from Altman that horrified studio representatives. Altman insisted that real drinking would create the authentic atmosphere of a MASH unit, where surgeons used alcohol to cope with trauma. He told the cast, "I don't want you drunk, but I want you loose." For scenes in the officers' club and the swamp tent where the doctors lived, real scotch and gin were available to actors who wanted it. This unorthodox approach created legitimate concerns among studio insurance representatives, who tried repeatedly to shut it down. Their worries weren't unfounded. Several scenes had to be reshot after actors became too intoxicated to deliver lines coherently. Donald Sutherland later revealed, "There were days when we crossed the line from acting to actually being these characters." Elliott Gould admitted, "Sometimes we'd forget we were making a movie and just become these doctors unwinding after surgery." The drinking culture extended beyond filming hours, with cast and crew gathering nightly at a local bar near the shooting location. These after-hours sessions often became impromptu rehearsals, where the next day's scenes would be reworked over drinks. Fact number 17. The Japanese sequence was a disaster. That Altman saved the sequence where Hawkeye and Duke visit Japan was originally a full 30-minute section that went so catastrophically wrong during filming that it nearly tanked the entire production. This sequence, shot in actual Japanese locations, was plagued with problems. The Japanese extras couldn't understand Altman's direction, equipment malfunctioned in the humidity, and Donald Sutherland contracted a severe case of pneumonia that shut down production for nearly a week. When the footage was assembled, it was unusable, poorly lit, inconsistently performed, and narratively incoherent. Studio executives watched the rough cut and immediately demanded the entire Japan sequence be scrapped, arguing that reshooting would blow the already strained budget. Altman's solution was ingenious. Rather than abandon the footage entirely, he radically condensed it from 30 minutes to roughly 3 minutes and presented it as a fragmented, dreamlike montage. He added deliberately disorienting editing cuts and overlaid it with chaotic sound design. What had been a narrative disaster became a stylistic triumph that critics later praised as brilliantly conveying the disorienting nature of war. Altman had transformed a filmmaking catastrophe into one of the movie's most distinctive sequences, later admitting, "Sometimes your biggest problems become your greatest assets." Fact about 18. Radar's character was created during filming. Gary Burghoff's character of Radar O'Reilly, who became central to both the film and later TV series, wasn't a significant character in the original script. His role expanded because of an accident on set. Burghoff was initially cast in a minor role with just a few lines as a company clerk. During an early scene, he improvised picking up a phone seconds before it actually rang, demonstrating his character's radar for incoming communication. Altman was so impressed by this unscripted moment that he stopped filming and asked Burghoff, "Can you do that again?" From that point forward, Altman began expanding Radar's character, adding scenes, and developing the psychic abilities that would become his trademark. The script was constantly revised to give Burghoff more screen time as filming progressed. What audiences didn't realize was that many of Radar's signature characteristics, holding his teddy bear, his innocent Midwestern demeanor, his ability to mimic commanding officers, were Burghoff's own improvisations rather than scripted elements. The character became so beloved that Burghoff was the only actor from the film to reprise his role in the television series, appearing in over 170 episodes before eventually departing in the show's 8th season. Fact feature 19. The film was originally rated X-Mass. Wasn't initially rated R. The MPAA gave it an X rating, which would have effectively killed its commercial prospects by limiting it to adults-only theaters. When Fox executives received the X rating, they panicked. An X-rated film in 1970 was commercial suicide for a major studio release. It would be barred from mainstream theaters and advertising outlets. The rating wasn't for sexual content, but for the graphic surgical scenes and the film's irreverent treatment of suicide, religion, and military authority. Rather than cut the film to secure an R rating, Fox took an unprecedented approach. They appealed directly to the MPAA, arguing that Mass H deserved special consideration as an important cultural work. The studio emphasized the film's anti-war message and its realistic portrayal of military medical conditions. In a landmark decision, the MPAA agreed to revise the rating from X to R without requiring any cuts. This victory set a precedent that would influence film ratings for years to come, establishing that graphic content could be acceptable when presented in a serious artistic context. Altman later claimed this battle over the rating was actually beneficial. The controversy got us more publicity than we could ever afford to buy. Everyone wanted to see the film that almost got an X rating. Fact number 20. The football game wasn't in the original script. The climactic football game that provides the film's rousing finale wasn't in the screenplay. It was added midway through production when Altman realized he needed a stronger ending. The original script ended with a rather anticlimactic scene of Hawkeye and Duke simply being discharged and leaving Korea. Altman felt this was emotionally unsatisfying and failed to bring the ensemble cast together for a proper conclusion. He approached Fox executives with an unusual request, an additional $35,000 to stage an elaborate football game between the 4077th MASH unit and a rival military team. The studio was reluctant, until Altman framed it as a metaphor for the Korean conflict itself. A brutal competition with arbitrary rules where people get hurt for no good reason. What viewers don't realize is that much of the football sequence was filmed without permits on public land. Altman didn't have time to secure proper authorization for the expanded shooting schedule, so the crew essentially guerrilla filmed portions of the game in areas where they had no permission to be. The impromptu nature of this sequence explains its documentary-like feel. Many moments were captured with handheld cameras as the crew rushed to get shots before being discovered by local authorities.
Bonus fact.
MASH didn't just shock audiences. It launched a secret congressional investigation into Hollywood's portrayal of the military that remained classified for decades. In the politically charged climate of 1970, with anti-Vietnam sentiment growing, certain members of Congress became concerned about Mass H's influence on public perception of the military. While ostensibly set during the Korean War, the film was widely interpreted as commentary on Vietnam. Documents declassified in the early 2000s revealed that a subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee initiated a confidential investigation into whether Mass H and similar films constituted psychological warfare against America's military readiness. Military recruitment numbers had dropped significantly in areas where the film was especially popular. The investigation included surveillance of Robert Altman and interviews with military personnel who had served as technical advisors on the film. The committee ultimately concluded that while Mass H was potentially damaging to military morale, there were no legal grounds to restrict such content. What makes this especially ironic is that the Army had initially supported the production, providing military vehicles and equipment. After seeing the completed film, they issued an internal memo instructing all branches of service to deny any future cooperation with Altman, a blacklisting that affected his ability to make military-themed films for the rest of his career. MASH wasn't just a film that changed cinema. It was a cultural detonation that transformed how America viewed war, authority, and the human response to trauma. What began as an unwanted project, rejected by 15 directors, and nearly buried by its own studio, emerged as one of the most influential films in Hollywood history. Its revolutionary techniques of overlapping dialogue, improvisational acting, and documentary-style camera work created a new visual language for filmmakers that continues to this day. The chaos behind the scenes, actors trying to fire their director, real injuries during filming, alcohol-fueled performances, and battles with censors, somehow alchemized into cinematic gold. It wasn't calculated. It was combustion. If you enjoyed these revelations about this groundbreaking film, hit subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stories that change how you see cinema classics. And remember, in the words of Hawkeye Pierce, the only way to survive a war is to make it yours.